Detective Maria Santos had walked through crime scenes that would haunt most people for life. 20 years on the force had shown her humanity's darkest corners, domestic violence cases that made seasoned officers weep, gang shootings that painted entire city blocks in blood, and child abuse investigations that required therapy just to process. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for what she witnessed on Maple Street that cold October night. The 911 call came in at 11:47 p.m. Multiple shots fired, screaming stopped. When Maria and her partner arrived at the modest two-story house, the silence was deafening. No sirens wailing, no neighbors gathering, just an eerie quiet that made veteran cops check their weapons twice. The front door hung open like a wound, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with something else, something Maria's brain refused to process, until she stepped inside. 3 bodies lay scattered across the living room. Dr. James Chun, age 45, a beloved pediatrician at Children's Hospital, was found near the kitchen doorway, 3 bullets to the chest. His wife, Susan Chun, age 42, a high school art teacher, had been shot execution style while kneeling by the couch, her hands zip-tied behind her back. Their son Tommy, just 16 and captain of his school's debate team, lay crumpled by the stairs, apparently gunned down while trying to flee upstairs to warn his sister. But Rebecca wasn't upstairs. She wasn't anywhere they could find. Santos, over here. Officer Martinez called from the master bedroom closet. Behind winter coats and storage boxes, curled in the farthest corner, was 18-year-old Rebecca Chun. Her dark eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking, like glass marbles reflecting nothing. Her family's blood spattered her UCLA sweatshirt and jeans. She was breathing, technically alive, but something essential had been extinguished. "Rebecca? Honey, I'm Detective Santos." "You're safe now," Maria whispered, crouching down slowly. Rebecca didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge her presence. Her body was rigid, frozen in the exact position she'd assumed hours earlier when the shooting started. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but Rebecca refused to move. Not couldn't refused. She had wedged herself so tightly into the corner that they considered sedation, until Maria made a decision that would change everything. She climbed into that closet, sat beside this shattered girl, and simply waited. For 2 hours, Maria Santos sat in that cramped closet while crime scene investigators worked around them, while the medical examiner bagged the bodies of Rebecca's family, while neighbors were interviewed and evidence was collected. She didn't try to coax Rebecca out. She didn't attempt therapy or investigation techniques. She just sat there, occasionally whispering, "You're not alone. I'm right here with you." At 3:15 a.m., Rebecca finally moved. Not walking out, but collapsing sideways into Maria's arms, like a marionette with severed strings. The detective carried her out of that house of horrors, past the chalk outlines and blood stains, into an ambulance that would take them both to Presbyterian Hospital. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, the hospital's head psychiatrist, had treated trauma victims for 15 years, but Rebecca's case defied every textbook she'd studied. The girl exhibited symptoms of extreme dissociative disorder, selective mutism, and survivor's guilt so severe, bordered on catatonia. She could hear, could understand, could even perform basic functions like eating and using the bathroom, but she hadn't spoken a single word in 3 months. "She's trapped inside her own mind," Dr. Rodriguez explained to Maria during one of her daily visits. The trauma was so overwhelming that her brain essentially hit an emergency brake. She's conscious, but completely disconnected from the external world. Maria visited every single day, sometimes reading police reports aloud, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. She watched Rebecca stare out the hospital window for hours, as if searching for something that no longer existed. Physical therapy helped Rebecca walk again, but her movements were mechanical, robotic. Occupational therapy taught her to perform daily tasks, but she executed them without emotion, like a computer running programs. The breakthrough began, ironically, with another case of trauma. Maria was investigating a veteran's PTSD episode when she learned about psychiatric service dogs, specially trained animals who could detect anxiety attacks, interrupt nightmares, and provide deep pressure therapy for panic disorders. The program. Director Patricia Williams mentioned they had a remarkable German shepherd named Max, whose previous partner had passed away. Max is special, Patricia explained. He can sense emotional changes before the person even realizes what's happening. He saved 3 lives from suicide attempts and has a 97% success rate in preventing severe dissociative episodes. Something clicked in Maria's mind. She thought about Rebecca's vacant stares, her frozen posture, the way she seemed to retreat deeper inside herself each day. What if Rebecca needed more than human help? What if she needed something that could reach past her psychological barriers? The hospital was skeptical. Rebecca's insurance balked at the cost. Her remaining family members, an aunt and uncle in Seattle, questioned whether a dog could help where doctors had failed. But Maria had learned to trust her instincts, and every instinct screamed that Rebecca and Max needed each other. The meeting was arranged for a Tuesday morning in the hospital's therapy garden. Rebecca sat in her usual position back straight, hands folded, eyes focused on nothing. Max entered with Patricia, his black coat gleaming in the sunlight, his intelligent brown eyes scanning the environment for threats or triggers. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Max lay down several feet away, simply observing. Then, without any command or encouragement, he rose and walked slowly toward Rebecca. He didn't jump or bark or demand attention. Instead, he approached like he understood that this broken girl needed gentleness, needed patience, needed someone who wouldn't try to fix her, but would simply be present. Max settled beside Rebecca's chair and carefully, deliberately, placed his massive head on her lap. And for the first time in 97 days, Rebecca Chun began to cry. Not the silent tears that had occasionally leaked from her eyes, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from her soul. Her hands, which hadn't voluntarily touched another living being since that night, moved to Max's fur. She buried her, face in his neck, and wept for her murdered family, for her shattered innocence, for the girl she used to be, who died in that closet alongside her loved ones. Maria Santos, who had seen colleagues break down after difficult cases, who had comforted countless victims and their families. Stu? 6 months after that first transformative meeting with Max, Rebecca Chun's world had slowly begun to reconstruct itself, piece by fragile piece. The hospital room that had been her prison became a sanctuary where she and Max developed an unspoken language of healing. Every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, Max would arrive with his handler, Patricia Williams, and the real therapy would begin, not the kind found in textbooks, but the ancient, wordless communication between human and animal that transcended psychological barriers. Dr. Angela Rodriguez documented every small victory in Rebecca's file. The first time she voluntarily fed Max a treat, the afternoon she smiled when he performed a trick, the evening she fell asleep with her hand resting on his fur, instead of clutching her knees in defensive position. These moments seemed insignificant to outsiders, but to the medical team watching Rebecca's slow emergence from her psychological cocoon, they represented miraculous progress. The real test came when District Attorney James Rodriguez, no relation to Dr. Rodriguez, despite the shared surname, requested a meeting. James had been prosecuting violent crimes for 12 years, building cases that put monsters behind bars. But the Shun family massacre had haunted him unlike any other. The perpetrators, Marcus Thompson and his accomplice Jake Sullivan, had been arrested within 48 hours, thanks to DNA evidence and witnesses who'd seen their distinctive motorcycle fleeing the scene. The physical evidence was overwhelming. But without Rebecca's testimony, the prosecution's case had a gaping hole that defense attorneys could exploit. "She's our only eyewitness," James explained to Dr. Rodriguez and Detective Santos during a tense conference room meeting. Thompson's lawyer is already arguing that the blood evidence could be contaminated, that the witnesses only saw a motorcycle, not necessarily his motorcycle. Without Rebecca's testimony, we're looking at plea bargains and reduced sentences for the men who executed an entire family. Dr. Rodriguez shook her head emphatically. Absolutely not. Rebecca hasn't spoken a word since the trauma. Forcing her to relive those events could trigger a complete psychological breakdown. We could lose all the progress she's made. But Detective Santos, who had spent countless hours observing Rebecca's sessions with Max, saw something the others missed. "She's stronger than you think," Maria insisted. "Yesterday, I watched her tell Max, without words, exactly where she wanted him to position himself when she had a panic attack. She's communicating, just not with us." The debate continued for weeks. Rebecca's surviving family, her Aunt Linda, and Uncle Robert from Seattle flew in for emergency meetings. They were torn between wanting justice for their murdered relatives and protecting their traumatized niece from further harm. The media had caught wind of the case's challenges, with headlines screaming, "Lone survivor silent," and "Killers may walk free." James Rodriguez knew he was fighting against time. Defense attorney Victoria Walshaw, shark in designer suits who had never lost a murder case, was filing motion after motion to suppress evidence and delay proceedings. Every day that passed gave her more ammunition to argue that memories fade, evidence degrades, and witnesses become unreliable. The breakthrough nobody expected came during what should have been a routine therapy session. Rebecca sat in her usual spot in the hospital's therapy garden, Max lying across her feet in his signature protective position. Dr. Rodriguez was taking notes when Patricia Williams suggested they try something new, controlled exposure therapy, technique where Rebecca would practice describing simple, non-threatening events while Max provided emotional support. They started small. Rebecca managed to nod when asked if she remembered her favorite color, blue. She pointed to flowers when asked about things that made her happy. Baby steps, but steps nonetheless. Then Dr. Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. "Rebecca," she said gently, "I want you to try something for me. You don't have to speak out loud. Just mouth the words, okay? Can you tell me one thing you remember about that night, anything at all?" The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Rebecca's breathing became rapid and shallow, her eyes dilated, and her entire body began trembling uncontrollably. She was slipping into a dissociative episode, retreating back into the protective void where the trauma couldn't reach her. Dr. Rodriguez immediately began emergency grounding techniques, but nothing worked. Rebecca was disappearing before their eyes. That's when Max did something remarkable. Without any command from Patricia, without any training protocol being activated, Max rose from his position at Rebecca's feet and placed his considerable weight directly across her chest and torso. Technique called deep pressure therapy that mimics the feeling of being held safely. His warm, heavy body created an anchor point that Rebecca's fractured mind could grab onto. The change was immediate. Rebecca's breathing slowed, her trembling stopped, and her eyes began to focus again. But more incredibly, as Max's weight pressed against her, she began to whisper, not words exactly, but sounds. Soft, broken syllables that Patricia recognized as attempts at speech. "She's trying to talk," Patricia breathed, hardly daring to move. Dr. Rodriguez leaned closer, and what she heard made her heart stop. Rebecca wasn't just making sounds, she was saying a word, over and over, so quietly it was barely audible. Safe ... safe ... safe ... The room erupted in emotions none of them had expected. Dr. Rodriguez wept openly. Patricia Williams grabbed her phone to call Rebecca's family, and Detective Santos stepped outside to compose herself before calling District Attorney Rodriguez with the impossible news. Rebecca Chun had spoken her first word in 8 months. But the real miracle happened in the days that followed. With Max providing deep pressure therapy during controlled sessions, Rebecca began forming more words. First single syllables. No. Please. Help. Then short phrases. Max, stay. Don't. Leave. I remember. James Rodriguez received the call he'd been praying for on a Thursday afternoon. Dr. Rodriguez's voice was cautious, but hopeful. She wants to try. Rebecca says she wants to tell what happened, but only with Max present. She's not ready for a courtroom, but she'll practice with you, if you can guarantee Max will be there every step of the way. The district attorney had prosecuted hundreds of cases, but he'd never felt pressure like this. Rebecca Chun wasn't just a witness. She was a survivor who had found her voice after months of silence. And that voice might be the key to ensuring her family's killers never hurt anyone again. The real battle was just beginning. Defense attorney Victoria Walsh had built her reputation on demolishing prosecutors' cases with surgical precision. At 43, she commanded courtrooms like a battlefield general, her steel-gray eyes dissecting witnesses until they crumbled. Under cross-examination, she had never lost a murder case in 15 years of practice, and she wasn't about to start with Marcus Thompson and Jake Sullivan, 2 men she privately considered barely human, but professionally defended with unwavering dedication to the law. When District Attorney James Rodriguez filed his motion requesting permission for Rebecca Chun's service dog to accompany her during testimony, Victoria saw it as an early Christmas gift. She immediately called her research team into her glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Los Angeles. This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that destroys fair trials, she announced, spreading case files across the mahogany table. A traumatized girl with a sympathetic dog? The jury will convict my clients based on feelings, not facts. We're going to bury this motion so deep it never sees daylight. Her team worked around the clock, filing 17 separate motions over the next 2 weeks. Motion to exclude the service dog as prejudicial evidence. Motion to require Rebecca's psychiatric records be made public. Motion to declare her testimony inadmissible due to trauma-induced memory issues. Motion to change venues due to media coverage. Each filing was a calculated attack designed to either eliminate Rebecca as a witness entirely or make her testimony so problematic that Judge Harrison Mitchell would have no choice but to dismiss the case. Judge Mitchell, however, was no ordinary jurist. At 61, he had presided over some of California's most high-profile cases, earning a reputation for fairness that transcended political lines. He had sent gang leaders to death row and freed wrongfully convicted men with equal dedication to justice. But this case presented legal territory he'd never navigated before. The judge spent his evenings in his home study, surrounded by law books that seemed to mock him with their silence on this specific issue. The Americans with Disabilities Act was clear about service animals in public spaces, but courtrooms existed in a legal gray area. Previous cases involved guide dogs for blind attorneys or emotional support animals for witnesses with PTSD, but nothing quite like Rebecca's situation. Precedent is sparse, Your Honor, his clerk, Jennifer Park, reported during one of their late-night research sessions. We found a case in Colorado where a therapy dog was allowed during a child's testimony in a sexual abuse trial, but the defense didn't object. In Texas, a similar request was denied because the judge ruled it could influence the jury. We're essentially writing new law here. The media attention intensified daily. CNN legal analyst Sarah Kim called it the most significant disability rights case since the ADA was enacted. Protesters began gathering outside the courthouse. Disability rights advocates holding signs reading, "Justice for Rebecca" and "Max saves lives," while defense attorney supporters countered with "fair trials for all" and nitrogen monoxide emotional manipulation. Rebecca watched the coverage from her hospital room. Max pressed against her side as her anxiety spiked with each news report. The girl who had barely spoken 10 words in 6 months was now the center of a national debate about justice, disability rights, and the role of service animals in legal proceedings. Dr. Angela Rodriguez found herself thrust into the spotlight as well, fielding calls from medical journals and legal scholars requesting expert opinions on trauma testimony and service animal therapy. "People don't understand," she explained to Detective Santos during one particularly frustrating day. "This isn't about emotional manipulation. Max literally prevents Rebecca from dissociating during traumatic recall. Without him, her testimony would be impossible, not because she's weak, but because her brain has protective mechanisms that shut down when overwhelmed." A breakthrough in Judge Mitchell's deliberations came from an unexpected source. His own daughter, Sarah, who worked as a physical therapist at the VA hospital, shared a story about a veteran whose service dog had prevented 3 suicide attempts by detecting the early signs of PTSD episodes. "Dad," she said over their weekly dinner, "you always taught me that justice means giving everyone an equal chance to be heard. If Rebecca can't testify without Max, then denying Max means denying her voice. That's not protecting the defendant's rights. That's silencing the victim." That night, Judge Mitchell reviewed security footage that Patricia Williams had submitted showing Rebecca's sessions with Max. He watched the dog interrupt panic attacks before they fully developed, guide Rebecca away from triggers she wasn't even consciously aware of, and provide the deep pressure therapy that kept her grounded during traumatic discussions. This wasn't a pet providing comfort. This was a highly trained medical intervention tool. But Victoria Walsh wasn't finished. She filed for an emergency hearing, bringing in her own expert witnesses, a retired judge who testified that allowing the dog would irreparably prejudice the jury, a psychologist who argued that Rebecca's testimony would be unreliable regardless of animal support, and a legal scholar who claimed the prosecution was exploiting a tragic situation to guarantee conviction through sympathy rather than evidence. "Your Honor," Victoria argued during the packed hearing, her voice carrying the authority of years in courtrooms, "my clients deserve a trial based on facts, not on the emotional response a traumatized girl and her service dog will inevitably provoke. The prosecution has abundant physical evidence, DNA, fingerprints, ballistics. They don't need to parade a victim's psychological trauma before the jury to secure conviction." District Attorney Rodriguez countered passionately. "The defense wants to silence our only eyewitness, not because her testimony is unreliable, but because it's devastatingly accurate. Rebecca Chun spent 4 hours hiding in a closet, watching these defendants execute her family. Her service dog doesn't make her testimony more emotional. He makes it possible." Judge Mitchell announced he would render his decision within 48 hours. That night, alone in his chambers, he reviewed every piece of evidence, every legal precedent, every expert opinion. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. His ruling wouldn't just determine the outcome of this case. It would establish precedent that could affect disability rights and criminal justice for generations to come. The next morning, Judge Mitchell's decision arrived by courier to both legal teams simultaneously. Victoria Walsh read it twice, her confident expression cracking for the first time in her career. District Attorney Rodriguez actually whooped with joy before composing himself. Detective Santos, waiting anxiously by her phone, received the news. That would change everything. Judge Harrison Mitchell had ruled in favor of allowing Max in the courtroom, but with conditions so strict and specific that the real battle was just beginning. Judge Mitchell's ruling hit the legal world like a seismic shock. The decision, leaked to the press within hours despite court secrecy protocols, sent ripples across social media platforms and ignited debates in law schools nationwide. The conditions he'd imposed were unprecedented in their specificity. Max could remain in the courtroom during Rebecca's testimony, but he must stay in a designated area behind the witness stand, completely out of the jury's line of sight. He could not make any sounds, movements, or interactions that might draw attention. Most challenging of all, if Rebecca required Max's intervention during her testimony, it would trigger an immediate recess, potentially fragmenting her account across multiple sessions. By 6 a.m. the next morning, news vans lined every street surrounding the courthouse. Satellite dishes sprouted like mechanical flowers, beaming the story to networks across 6 continents. Hashtag Justice for Rebecca began trending worldwide, but so did hashtag Fair Trial First, creating a digital battlefield that reflected the complex emotions surrounding the case. Rebecca Chun woke to the sound of helicopter rotors circling overhead. From her hospital room window, she could see reporters setting up camps on the sidewalks below, their camera lenses glinting in the morning sun like predatory eyes. The girl who had spent 8 months trying to become invisible was now the most visible person in America. "We can still withdraw the testimony," Dr. Angela Rodriguez offered gently as Rebecca sat frozen, watching the media spectacle unfold. "This attention isn't healthy for your recovery. We could petition the court." "No." Rebecca's voice, still barely above a whisper, carried a steel that surprised everyone in the room. Max, sensing her elevated stress levels, moved closer and performed his signature deep pressure therapy, lying across her legs. "They killed my family. Tommy was going to Stanford. Mom was painting again. Dad was ... They were everything. I won't let them escape because I'm scared of cameras." Detective Maria Santos had seen media circuses before, but nothing compared to this. She arrived at the courthouse to find protesters 3 lines deep, their chants creating a cacophony that could be heard 6 blocks away. Disability rights activists held vigil with service dogs of every breed, their signs reading "Heroes have 4 legs too," and "Service dogs save lives." Counter-protesters, organized by a defense attorneys association, carried signs proclaiming, "Justice is blind, not emotional, and fair trials matter." The situation turned volatile when someone leaked Rebecca's hospital address. Reporters began attempting to sneak into Presbyterian Hospital, disguising themselves as visitors, delivery drivers, even maintenance workers. Security guards found a photographer hiding in a supply closet, hoping to catch a glimpse of Rebecca and Max together. The hospital was forced to hire private security and establish a media blackout zone around Rebecca's floor. CNN's legal analyst Sarah Kim hosted a primetime special titled "The Dog That Could Change Justice," featuring split-screen debates between constitutional scholars, disability rights advocates, and criminal defense attorneys. "We're witnessing a fundamental shift in how American courts accommodate disability," Kim declared to her 6 million viewers. Rebecca Chun's case could establish precedent that affects every traumatized witness for the next century. But the media attention brought unexpected dangers. Anonymous threats flooded the district attorney's office, the hospital, and even Patricia Williams' service dog training facility. Someone spray-painted "fake victim" across the hospital's main entrance. A disturbing message arrived at Dr. Rodriguez's home. Dogs don't belong in courtrooms. Neither do lying witnesses. Marcus Thompson's supporters, a disturbing coalition of anti-government extremists and criminal justice reformers, began their own social media campaign. They shared conspiracy theories about Rebecca's convenient memory recovery, questioned why she'd survived when her family hadn't, and suggested the prosecution was using her trauma to manipulate public opinion. Hashtag Rebecca Lies started trending in certain corners of the internet, forcing law enforcement to take the threat seriously. Victoria Walsh, meanwhile, played the media game like a chess grandmaster. She appeared on every major network, her polished appearance and measured words painting her clients as victims of a biased system. "My heart breaks for Rebecca Chun's losses," she said during a particularly effective interview with Fox News. "But we cannot allow grief and sympathy to override constitutional protections. The moment we convict defendants based on emotional response rather than evidence, we've abandoned the principles that separate us from authoritarian regimes." Her media blitz was working. Public opinion polls showed growing concern about courtroom manipulation, and legal scholars began publishing op-eds questioning whether Judge Mitchell's ruling had gone too far. The New York Times ran a front-page analysis titled, "When Justice Gets Emotional: The Dangerous Precedent of Comfort Animals in Criminal Trials." Rebecca's family found themselves thrust into the spotlight they'd never wanted. Her Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert flew back from Seattle, forced to navigate reporters camped outside their hotel. "She's just a girl who watched her family die," Linda pleaded during an impromptu press conference. "She's not a political statement or a legal experiment. She's a broken child trying to find the strength to seek justice." The pressure intensified when Rebecca's therapy sessions were subpoenaed by the defense. Victoria Walsh argued that if the prosecution wanted to use Rebecca's emotional state to justify Max's presence, then the defense deserved access to all psychiatric records to challenge her mental competency. Dr. Rodriguez fought the subpoena, but the legal battle added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. 5 days before the trial, the unthinkable happened. Rebecca suffered her first major panic attack in weeks, triggered by a nightmare about reporters breaking into the courtroom during her testimony. Max's intervention prevented a complete dissociative episode, but the incident raised serious questions about whether she could handle the pressure of testifying in front of a packed courtroom filled with cameras, reporters, and the men who had murdered her family. That night, as news helicopters circled overhead and protesters maintained their vigil outside, Rebecca made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Sitting in her hospital bed with Max's reassuring weight across her lap, she looked at Detective Santos, Dr. Rodriguez, and District Attorney Rodriguez. "I want to see the courtroom," she said, her voice stronger than anyone had heard it since that terrible October night. "Before the trial starts, I want to go there with Max. I need to see or I'll tell the truth about what they did to my family. The media would have to wait." Rebecca Chun was ready to face her demons. Dawn broke over Los Angeles like a crimson warning. Rebecca Chun hadn't slept, despite Dr. Rodriguez's gentle suggestion of mild sedatives. She sat by her hospital window, watching the city wake up to what media outlets were calling the most anticipated criminal trial of the decade. Max lay pressed against her side, his warm fur absorbing the tremors that ran through her body like aftershocks from an earthquake she couldn't escape. At 4:47 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text from Detective Santos. "Courthouse secure. No protesters. Inside, we've got your back, kid." Rebecca read it 3 times, finding strength in the simple words. She had requested this pre-trial visit to the courtroom during her darkest moment of doubt, and now, as the reality of facing that space approached, part of her wanted to hide under the hospital blankets forever. Patricia Williams arrived at 6 a.m. sharp with Max's court uniform, a specially designed harness that identified him as a working service dog and included a small camera that would record his interactions with Rebecca for legal review. The harness was sleek black leather with silver buckles, making Max look more official, more legitimate, as if his presence needed justification beyond the obvious miracle of Rebecca's recovered voice. The hospital had arranged for a service elevator and private exit to avoid the media encampment, but even the back route felt like navigating a battlefield. 3 unmarked police cars formed an escort convoy, their presence both protective and ominous. Rebecca sat in the back seat of the middle vehicle, Max beside her, watching Los Angeles roll past through tinted windows that made the world look darker, more threatening. District Attorney James Rodriguez met them at the courthouses. Secure entrance, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something more cautious. The judge agreed to this visit because he understands you need to acclimate, he explained as they walked through empty hallways that would soon overflow with reporters, legal teams, and curiosity seekers. But once you see that courtroom, once you sit in that witness chair, there's no going back. Are you absolutely certain you're ready for this? Rebecca nodded, though her hands shook as she gripped Max's harness. They had practiced this moment dozens of times in therapy sessions, but nothing could have prepared her for the overwhelming reality of Courtroom 4A. The space was larger than she'd imagined, with mahogany panels that seemed to absorb sound and light. 200 seats stretched behind the rail that separated spectators from the legal arena. The judge's bench loomed like a mountain, and the witness stand, her destination, looked impossibly small and exposed. But what struck Rebecca most forcefully was the defendant's table, where tomorrow Marcus Thompson and Jake Sullivan would sit, watching her every word, every gesture, every moment of vulnerability. This is where they'll be, James Rodriguez said quietly, indicating the defense table. Victoria Walsh will be right there, and she'll try to make you doubt yourself, doubt your memories. But remember, you don't have to convince her. You just have to tell the truth to the jury. Judge Mitchell emerged from his chambers, his black robes making him look more imposing than during their previous meetings. He approached Rebecca with grandfatherly gentleness, his voice echoing strangely in the empty courtroom. This is your space tomorrow, Rebecca. These walls have heard thousands of stories, witnessed countless moments of truth. You'll add your voice to that history. They walked through each step of the process. How she would enter, where Max would position himself in the designated area behind the witness stand, the signal system they developed if she needed him. Closer during testimony. The court reporter demonstrated her stenography machine, explaining how every word would be preserved for history. The bailiff showed Rebecca the panic button under the witness stand's ledge, a safety measure Judge Mitchell had insisted upon. Max explored his designated area methodically, his training evident as he tested sightlines and distances. Patricia Williams watched proudly as he positioned himself where he could monitor Rebecca without being visible to the jury box. He understands. This is important, she murmured to Dr. Rodriguez. Look how he's studying every angle. Then came the moment Rebecca had been dreading, sitting in the witness chair. The leather seat was worn smooth by thousands of previous witnesses, victims and criminals, heroes and villains, people telling truths and lies that shaped lives forever. As Rebecca settled into the chair, the weight of responsibility crashed over her like a tsunami. I can see them, she whispered, staring at the defense table. Tomorrow, I'll have to look at their faces and tell everyone what they did to Tommy, to Mom and Dad, ... Her breathing accelerated, her vision began to tunnel, and Dr. Rodriguez started toward her, but Max was faster. Despite being in his designated position 15 feet away, he sensed Rebecca's rising panic and moved with purpose that transcended his training. He crossed the courtroom floor and positioned himself beside the witness stand, his massive head resting on Rebecca's knee. The touch grounded her instantly. Her breathing slowed, her vision cleared, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she felt a spark of the courage that had kept her alive that terrible night. Tomorrow will be different, Dr. Rodriguez said gently. There will be people everywhere, cameras, noise. The men who hurt your family will be right there, and their lawyer will challenge everything you say. Are you prepared for that reality? Rebecca looked around the courtroom one more time at the empty jury box that would soon hold 12 strangers who would decide her family's legacy. At the judge's bench, where justice would either prevail or fail. At the defense table, where evil would wear expensive suits and legal legitimacy. When she spoke, her voice carried a strength that surprised everyone present. They took everything from me, she said, her words echoing off the mahogany walls. My family, my voice, my life. But they didn't break me. Max helped me find my way back, and tomorrow, I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what Marcus Thompson and Jake Sullivan are. She stood from the witness chair, Max immediately moving to her side, and walked toward the courtroom exit, with steps that grew stronger with each stride. Tomorrow, this empty courtroom would be packed with reporters, legal experts, and spectators from around the world. But tonight, Rebecca Chun had claimed her space. The real trial would begin in 18 hours. The morning of October 15th arrived with the weight of inevitability. Rebecca Chun woke at 4:23 a.m. from a nightmare where she was trapped in the courtroom. Witness stand while her family's killers laughed from the gallery. Max was already awake. Beside her hospital bed, his intelligent eyes reflecting the pre-dawn light streaming through the window. He had been restless all night, sensing the approaching storm of emotions that would test everything they'd built together over the past 8 months. By 6 a.m., the courthouse vicinity resembled a military zone. Police barricades held back crowds that had begun gathering at midnight. International news crews from BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and dozens of other networks claimed every available vantage point. Protesters carrying signs reading "Justice for the Chun Family" faced counter-protesters demanding fair trials, not manipulation. The cacophony of chants, camera clicks, and helicopter rotors created a symphony of chaos that could be heard for blocks. Detective Maria Santos arrived at the hospital to escort Rebecca, finding her sitting motionless in her wheelchair, a precautionary measure Dr. Rodriguez had insisted upon in case her legs gave out from stress. Rebecca wore the navy blue dress. Her Aunt Linda had chosen conservative and respectful, but her hands trembled as she gripped Max's leash like a lifeline. The entire world is watching, Rebecca whispered as they prepared to leave. What if I can't do this? What if I see their faces and forget everything? Dr. Rodriguez knelt beside the wheelchair, her voice gentle but firm. You've already done. The hardest part, you survived that night. Everything else is just telling the truth. Max pressed his snout against Rebecca's palm, performing the grounding technique they'd practiced hundreds of times. A convoy of 3 black SUVs navigated through crowds that pressed against police barriers, faces twisted with curiosity and judgment. Camera flashes exploded like lightning against the tinted windows. Rebecca closed her eyes, but she could still feel the weight of all those stares, all those expectations, all those people who had turned her family's tragedy into entertainment. Inside courtroom 4A, the transformation from yesterday's empty space to today's packed arena was staggering. Every seat was occupied journalists scribbling notes, legal scholars studying precedent, victims' rights advocates, and curiosity seekers who had waited in line since dawn. The air thrummed with tension and whispered conversations that fell silent as Rebecca entered through the side door. Marcus Thompson sat at the defense table in an expensive charcoal suit, his lawyer Victoria Walsh whispering final instructions. He was smaller than Rebecca remembered from her nightmares, more ordinary, but when his cold eyes met hers across the courtroom, she felt the same paralyzing terror that had kept her silent for 8 months. Judge Mitchell called the court to order, his gavel striking like thunder in the packed space. The state may call its next witness. District Attorney James Rodriguez stood with theatrical precision. The state calls Rebecca Chun. The walk to the witness stand stretched infinitely. Each step echoed despite the carpet, amplified by the absolute silence of 200 people holding their breath. Max walked beside her, his black coat gleaming under the harsh courtroom lights, his presence the only thing preventing her from collapsing under the weight of scrutiny. Rebecca was sworn in, her voice barely audible as she promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Max took his designated position behind the witness stand, invisible to the jury, but close enough that she could sense his steadying presence. DA Rodriguez began gently, establishing basic facts: her name, age, relationship to the victims. Rebecca's answers came in whispers that forced the court reporter to ask for repetition twice. The questions gradually approached the night that changed everything. Rebecca, I need you to take us back to October 13th, 2 years ago. Can you tell us what you remember about that evening? The courtroom seemed to shrink around her as Rebecca began recounting the last normal evening of her life. Her parents had cooked dinner together, Dad's famous stir-fry, while Mom critiqued his technique with loving sarcasm. Tommy had been practicing his college admissions essay aloud, his dreams of Stanford filling the kitchen with hope and possibility. We were watching a movie, Rebecca continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. Some romantic comedy Mom picked. Dad kept making jokes about the plot, and Tommy threw popcorn at him. We were just ... happy. We were just a family being happy. Victoria Walsh watched from the defense table, like a predator studying prey, taking notes that would later become weapons. Marcus Thompson stared at Rebecca with unsettling intensity, as if trying to will her back into silence through sheer malevolence. Rebecca's testimony continued, approaching the moment when their doorbell rang at 11:15 p.m. Her breathing began to accelerate as she described her father answering the door, the sound of his surprised voice saying, "Can I help you?" Then came the explosion of violence that shattered everything. They had guns, Rebecca said, her voice starting to shake. Dad tried to slam the door, but they forced their way in. Mom screamed for us to run upstairs, but Tommy ... Tommy tried to protect her. The courtroom was utterly silent except for the soft scratching of the court reporter's machine. Several jurors leaned forward, their faces reflecting the horror Rebecca was reliving in real time. I hid in the upstairs closet like Mom told me, she continued, tears beginning to stream down her face. I could hear everything, the shouting, the begging, the gunshots. 3 shots for Dad. Mom was crying, pleading with them. Then more shots. Rebecca's voice cracked completely as she reached the moment that had haunted her dreams for 2 years. Tommy was running up the stairs when they shot him. I heard him fall, and then ... silence, complete silence. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. The familiar tunnel vision began closing in. The courtroom started to blur at the edges as her mind prepared to retreat into the protective dissociation that had kept her sane during 8 months of nightmares. But this time was different. This time, 200 people were watching. This time, Marcus Thompson was staring at her with those same cold eyes that had looked down at her family's bodies. This time, justice hung in the balance. Rebecca felt herself slipping away from reality, disappearing into the void where trauma couldn't reach her. The courtroom faded, voices became distant echoes, and she began the familiar retreat into psychological safety. That's when she made the gesture that would change everything. The moment arrived like a slow-motion catastrophe. Rebecca Chun sat frozen in the witness stand, her eyes vacant and glassy, her breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. The packed courtroom of 200 people watched in horrified silence as she began disappearing before their eyes, not physically, but psychologically retreating into the protective void her traumatized mind had created as sanctuary from unbearable memories. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, seated in the gallery's front row, recognized the signs immediately. Rebecca's pupils were dilated. Her hands had stopped trembling and gone completely still, and her gaze had fixed on a point somewhere beyond the courtroom walls. This was dissociation in its most profound form, the mind's emergency brake, when reality became too overwhelming to process. District Attorney James Rodriguez realized his case was collapsing in real time. "Rebecca?" he said gently, but she didn't respond. Her body remained upright in the witness chair, but Rebecca Chun was no longer present in courtroom 4A. Victoria Walsh sensed victory. This was exactly what she'd hoped for, the prosecution's star witness, breaking down spectacularly. Her testimony, rendered unreliable by obvious psychological instability. She started to rise, preparing to object that the witness was clearly incompetent to continue, when something extraordinary happened. Max had been lying in his designated position behind the witness stand, invisible to the jury but intensely focused on Rebecca's every micro-expression. His training as a psychiatric service dog had taught him to recognize the subtle precursors to dissociative episodes. The change in breathing patterns, the slight dilation of pupils, the almost imperceptible stiffening of posture. He had prevented dozens of such episodes during their 8 months together, but never under these circumstances, never with so much at stake. In the suffocating silence of the courtroom, Max rose from his position. He didn't bark or whine or make any sound that would disrupt the proceedings. Instead, he moved with purpose and intelligence that seemed to transcend his training. Step by careful step, he approached the witness stand where Rebecca sat trapped in her psychological prison. Then came the gesture that would be replayed on news channels across the world for months to come. Rebecca, lost in the terrifying void of dissociation, felt something warm and familiar against her left hand, which hung limply at her side. Without conscious thought, operating on pure instinct developed through hundreds of therapy sessions, she slowly turned her palm upward. Her thumb, moving with dreamlike precision, began stroking the soft fur of Max's paw that he had gently placed. In her hand, the touch was electric, a lifeline thrown into the abyss where her mind had fled. The simple contact between human skin and canine fur created a bridge back to reality that no amount of therapy or medication had been able to achieve. In that moment of crisis, the courtroom held its collective breath as they witnessed something unprecedented in legal history. This wasn't a trained performance or emotional manipulation. This was raw, authentic human survival happening in real time. The gesture was so small, so intimate, so purely instinctive that it carried more power than any dramatic testimony could have mustered. Judge Harrison Mitchell felt tears gathering in his eyes as he watched this broken girl find her way back from psychological exile through the simple touch of her service dog's paw. In 30 years on the bench, he had never witnessed anything so fundamentally human, so achingly real. Several jurors wept openly. Juror number 7, a tough construction foreman named Mike Rodriguez, who had initially been skeptical of allowing a dog in the courtroom, pulled out his handkerchief and wiped his eyes without shame. Juror number 3, a retired teacher named Patricia Williams, placed her hand over her heart as if to keep it from breaking. Even the court reporters professionals trained to remain neutral observers paused in their transcription, moved beyond their capacity to remain detached. The stenographer, Maria Santos, would later tell her husband that in 20 years of recording testimony, she had never witnessed a moment so purely truthful. Marcus Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his cold eyes flickering with what might have been recognition of his own humanity. His accomplice, Jake Sullivan, stared at his hands, unable to watch the scene unfolding before them. Victoria Walsh, The undefeated defense attorney, who had built her reputation on demolishing prosecution witnesses, found herself paralyzed by the authenticity of the moment. This wasn't the kind of testimony she could cross-examine or discredit. This was truth in its most fundamental form, a traumatized survivor, finding the strength to continue through the love and support of a creature who asked nothing in return but the chance to serve. The gesture lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it felt like hours to everyone present. Slowly, gradually, Rebecca's breathing deepened. Her eyes began to focus again. The color returned to her pale cheeks. Max's gentle presence had accomplished what months of therapy had struggled to achieve. He had pulled her back from the edge of psychological collapse at the exact moment when justice hung in the balance. When Rebecca finally looked up, her eyes were clear for the first time since beginning her testimony. She looked directly at the jury, then at Judge Mitchell, and finally with courage that seemed to surprise even herself, at Marcus Thompson and Jake Sullivan sitting at the defense table. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. "Where was I?" District Attorney Rodriguez approached with reverence, as if walking on sacred ground. "You were telling us about hiding in the closet, Rebecca. What happened?" Next, Rebecca took a deep breath, her hand still resting on Max's paw. When she spoke again, her voice carried a clarity and strength that filled every corner of the packed courtroom. "I watched through the crack in the closet door as Marcus Thompson and Jake Sullivan stood over my family's bodies. Thompson was reloading his gun, and Sullivan was going through my father's wallet. They were laughing about something. Actually laughing while my parents and brother lay bleeding on our living room floor." The courtroom remained in absolute silence. But it was no longer the silence of witness to breakdown. It was the silence of recognition that they were hearing truth spoken with the kind of courage that defines the best of humanity. Rebecca Chun had found her voice again, and the world was finally ready to listen. Rebecca's testimony continued for another hour, but the courtroom had fundamentally changed after that transformative moment with Max. Her voice, once barely a whisper, now carried across the packed space with crystalline clarity. She described in devastating detail how Marcus Thompson had kicked her father's body to ensure he was dead, how Jake Sullivan had stolen her mother's wedding ring while she was still breathing, how they had argued about whether to burn the house down before ultimately deciding to flee on their motorcycle. The jury sat transfixed, no longer seeing a broken victim, but a survivor of extraordinary courage. When District Attorney James Rodriguez finished his direct examination, the silence in courtroom 4I was profound and respectful, the silence of people who had witnessed something sacred. Victoria Walsh approached the witness stand for cross-examination with visible reluctance. The undefeated defense attorney, who had demolished countless witnesses over 15 years, found herself facing something she had never encountered: absolute, unshakable truth. Her usual tactics, attacking memory, questioning motives, exposing inconsistencies, crumbled against the bedrock of Rebecca's authentic testimony. "Miss Chun," Victoria began carefully, "you've been through tremendous trauma. Isn't it possible that your memories of that night have been influenced by your therapy sessions?" Rebecca looked directly at her, Max's calming presence giving her strength. "Ma'am, I've spent 8 months trying to forget what I saw. Therapy didn't create these memories. It helped me find the courage to share them." Victoria tried several more approaches, but each question only reinforced Rebecca's credibility. When she attempted to challenge the timeline, Rebecca provided exact details about the digital clock on the cable box. When she questioned Rebecca's vantage point from the closet, Rebecca drew a precise diagram of the room layout that perfectly matched crime scene photographs. After 30 minutes of futile cross-examination, Victoria Walsh did something unprecedented in her career. She conceded. "No further questions, Your Honor." The prosecution rested, and the defense's case lasted less than a day. Marcus Thompson, and Jake Sullivan's attorneys called character witnesses who seemed increasingly uncomfortable defending men who had laughed over the bodies of an executed family. The physical evidence was overwhelming, but Rebecca's testimony had provided something more powerful than DNA or ballistics. It had given the jury a window into the souls of the defendants. Judge Mitchell's instructions to the jury were brief and clear. The 12 men and women retired to deliberate at 2:17 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. Legal experts predicted days of deliberation, given the case's complexity and media attention. But the jury had heard enough. At 3:47 p.m., just 90 minutes later, the court clerk received the call that would change everything. We have reached a verdict. The courtroom filled again with breathtaking speed. Rebecca sat in the front row with Max beside her, Detective Maria Santos holding her hand, Dr. Angela Rodriguez whispering reassurances. The media section buzzed with anticipation. As cameras focused on the jury box were 12 ordinary citizens prepared to speak for justice. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Mitchell asked. "We have, Your Honor," replied the forewoman, a middle-aged accountant named Jennifer Park, whose own eyes were red from crying. "On the charge of murder in the first degree against James Chun, how do you find?" "Guilty." The word hit the courtroom like a physical force. Rebecca gasped, tears streaming down her face, as 8 months of fear and uncertainty cracked open to release something she hadn't felt since that terrible night. Hope. "On the charge of murder in the first degree against Susan Chun, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of murder in the first degree against Thomas Chun, how do you find?" "Guilty." The verdicts continued guilty on all counts. Both defendants, no mercy, no doubt. Marcus Thompson stared straight ahead with dead eyes, finally revealed as the hollow monster he had always been. Jake Sullivan broke down sobbing, perhaps finally comprehending the magnitude of what they had done to an innocent family. As the verdicts were read, Rebecca collapsed into Detective Santos' arms, not from weakness, but from overwhelming relief. Max immediately moved to provide deep pressure therapy, sensing her emotional overload. But for the first time in months, Rebecca's tears were healing tears. Judge Mitchell sentenced both men to life without possibility of parole. "You didn't just murder 3 innocent people," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "You attempted to murder a 4th, the spirit and voice of Rebecca Chun, but you failed. She found her voice again, and through her courage, justice has prevailed." The media explosion that followed was unprecedented. Rebecca's story became an international symbol of survival and the power of the human-animal bond. Within 6 months, Rebecca's law had passed in 12 states, guaranteeing service dogs access to courtrooms for disabled witnesses. The legislation spread across the nation like wildfire, with legal scholars calling it the most significant disability rights advancements since the Americans with Disabilities Act. But the real transformation happened quietly, away from cameras and headlines. Rebecca began speaking at trauma survivor conferences, always with Max by her side. Their story inspired a documentary that won 3 Emmy Awards and changed public perception of PTSD and service animals forever. 2 years after the trial, Rebecca walked across the stage at UCLA Law School graduation, Max wearing a special cap and gown designed just for him. The audience erupted in a standing ovation that lasted 7 minutes, not just for Rebecca's academic achievement, but for her journey from a girl who had lost her voice to a woman who had found it again and used it to change the world. Detective Maria Santos, now retired, sat in the front row wiping tears of pride. Dr. Angela Rodriguez had flown in from her new position as head of trauma therapy at Johns Hopkins. District Attorney James Rodriguez, now a judge himself, beamed with paternal pride. But the most important presence was beside Rebecca on that graduation stage. Max, now showing some gray around his muzzle, but still alert and devoted, remained her constant companion. The gesture that had stopped a courtroom had started a revolution, not just in legal procedures, but in understanding the profound healing power of the bond between humans and the animals who choose to serve them. That quiet moment when Rebecca had stroked Max's paw with her thumb had lasted 30 seconds. Its impact would last forever. As Rebecca accepted her law degree and looked out at the cheering crowd, she knew that Tommy would have been proud, that her parents would have been amazed, and that their deaths, while senseless and tragic, had ultimately created something beautiful, a voice that would never be silenced again, and a legacy that would protect other survivors for generations to come. Justice had been served, but more importantly, love had triumphed over evil, and healing had proven stronger than trauma. In the end, that was the most powerful testimony of all.